Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm very delighted to moderate this important session on disaster recovery, with the objective of reviewing past experience and current practice to draw lessons and suggestions for further improvement. I'm sure that will be a great session, which will allow us to identify critical issues for long-term recovery and for reconstruction, and make recommendations to address related challenges. It's also an opportunity for me, personally, coming from Haiti. My name, by the way, is Yolande Surena, and I'm working on disaster risk management in Haiti. Learn from your experience, both from the panel and from the assistant, because I'm sure that we are going to have great questions from the assistants and also great comments. And bring all of that information to Haiti to improve our approach in post-disaster recovery. Thank you very much for all of you to be there. For the opening, my session will be focused in 4 areas. The first areas will be, we are going to discuss the priority issue to be addressed in post-disaster recovery. Then we are going to talk about the challenge and lesson learned in post-disaster recovery. We are going to have, since we have the opportunity to have representatives of 4 different countries in 4 different parts of the world, having the information on government effort in post-disaster recovery. And then we have the European Union and the World Bank, then we are lucky. Then we have the international organization, international organization on that matter. To begin our session, let me give the floor to the Honorable Siaosis Sovaleni, who is the Deputy Prime Minister of Tonga, for the opening statement. Mr. Sovaleni.
Distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen, I bring greetings from Tonga and some of my fellow delegates from the Pacific. It would be remiss of me not to acknowledge the assistance from the World Bank in actually making sure that we're here today with you. It is my honor to give the opening remark for this key plenary session on efforts for post-disaster recovery. Small island developing states are some of the most vulnerable countries, especially to disasters. 2 of those countries here from the Pacific, Tonga and Vanuatu, have been ranked first and third, respectively, in the vulnerable index. And both have recently suffered Category 5 tropical cyclones in recent years. For your information, Category 5 cyclones are those cyclones over 250 kilometers per hour. This plenary session is of significance to us, as we have experienced firsthand the magnitude of the efforts required for post-disaster recovery and the enormous challenges that we needed to address. We can reflect on the effectiveness and responsiveness of our efforts, the lessons learned, and what we could do better. Our responses and efforts are far more challenging, with the difficulties posed by remoteness, lack of accessibility, coordination of multitude of stakeholders, and prioritizing of limited financial, technical, and human resources. And of course, the need for rapid mobilization of financial resources. Ladies and gentlemen, the impact of climate change and extreme weather events are critical, at least for the Pacific. We are now facing an increase in the frequency and severity of tropical cyclones. In the past, in the Pacific, Category 5 cyclones were an event occurring at least once a decade. In the past 4 years, the Pacific region has been devastated by tropical cyclones Ian, Pam, and Winston, all Category 5 cyclones. Ladies and gentlemen, having experienced such disasters, and one of the most significant lessons that I have learned is that there is no silver bullet or one-size-fits-all solution to post-disaster response. Having said that, I wish to echo the earlier sentiments of the Vice President of the World Bank earlier this morning, that this conference presents a unique opportunity to build our toolbox with tools to effectively address those challenges that we must address in post-disaster recovery. That may include empowering policies and legislation, institutional arrangements, appropriate financing modality, building capacity, and strengthening resilience. I can also attest to the need in a post-disaster recovery of strengthening partnership, where all stakeholders are cooperating toward one goal. Together with donor countries, international organizations, civil society, private sector, and the beneficiaries themselves, these partners should be interacting as one team. Hence the need for many partners, one team. Ladies and gentlemen, while Tonga is committed to building back better, I wish to reiterate my statement in Sentai back in 2015. And that is, when we are able, we should build better now, with a view to reducing the impact of disasters. In conclusion, post-disaster recovery should be focused on efforts to provide some degree of normalcy to those affected, to revive their ability and means for livelihoods, strengthen their resilience, but more importantly, to leave no one behind. I look forward to sharing our lessons learned and to learn from your experience and expertise. I thank you all.
I thank you, Honorable Sayosis Sovalini, for your remarks and also for underlining for us and remind us that disaster arrive more often these days. Being in the island, I know what you're saying. And remind us also that if we want to face, you have to be better prepared. And also we have to build back better, as you just said, and remind us. Mobilization and coordination, policy and strategy are keywords. And we are going to keep that in mind. Now I'm going to introduce the speakers. You just right now know the name of the Honorable Sayosis Sovaleni, but you don't know a few things about him. He has an impressive background and is, for the last 3 years, is the Deputy Prime Minister and Ministry of Meteorology, Environment, Information, Disaster Management, Energy, Climate Change, and Communication for the Kingdom of Tonga. Please salute that deputy with me. I have to say he's also a member of the Agenda, Privilege and Environment Standing Committee of the Tonga Legislative Assembly. The Honorable Sovaleni holds a Master in Science in Computation from Oxford University, as well as a Master of Business Administration from the University of South Pacific. He has a Bachelor of Science from Auckland University in New Zealand. And I can tell you, that's a little summary of his summary. Thank you to be with us. We are going to have two keynote speakers. My first keynote speakers will be the director of Ridolfi from the European Union and the director Waba from the World Bank, who is going to give us a short to frame our session. Let me tell you about Roberto Ridolfi. He's the director of Sustainable Growth and Development at DG DECO since 2012. It was twice the head of the delegation of the European Union. Mr. Ridolfi has a great experience also in the Pacific countries and territories. And we are going to have also as a keynote speaker, Same Waba. I repeat, but still, it's difficult for me to repeat, to say the name well. I'm so sorry. He's the director of the Urban Territorial Development, Disaster Risk Management and Resilience at the World Bank, Group Social, Rural, Urban, and Resilience Global Practice based in Washington, D.C. He also has a large experience, not only in the Pacific, but mainly in the Latin American and Caribbean, Middle East, and North African region. He holds a PhD and a Master of Urban Planning from Harvard University, and a BS and a Master of Science in Architectural Engineering from Cairo University. He speaks all of the language. As a matter of fact, we are going to have translation, direct translation. We have translation in French, English, Spanish, and Portuguese. But in addition to that, he speaks also Arabic. If you want to have something translated in Arabic, you have to talk with him at one point of time. Most recently, he's the co-author of the Bank flagship publication on regenerating urban land, a practitioner guide for levering private investment. I have much more to say also with all of our panelists, but I want to put all of us before, and I'm sorry if I delayed your presentation, and to put ourselves in get the feeling of the session. I don't want to cut between the opening remark from the Honorable Serozzi Sovaleni and the rest of the presentation. Keep it warm. Then we are going to have the keynote speaker first. They have each of them 5 minutes of presentation to frame the discussion. Then after that, I will present to you the other panelists and begin to ask them some questions. And after that, I will leave the floor to you for your question. Please come to the microphone, Director Ridolfi from the European Union.
Messieurs, dames, bienvenue à Bruxelles. And most importantly, welcome back to back with the big event for DG Development, which is the European Development Days, tomorrow and the day after. So you got already your first tweet. Efforts in post-disaster recovery as part of the efforts for European to develop and to assist the partner countries. I would like to have very brief introductory remarks and few questions to leave to you, my fellow panelists, but also to the ensuing discussions. Of course, the EU has actually acted as a pioneer in promoting an approach of disaster prevention. Together with the UN system and the World Bank, signed in 2008 a joint declaration committing to collaborate on a common approach to assessing, planning, and mobilizing support for recovery. Since then, we have together conducted more than 48 post-disaster needs assessments in 40 countries under the leadership of the affected governments. So first point, the affected governments, wherever are and whatever are the circumstances, must be in the lead. Very, very important. When disaster impact is compounded by fragility and conflict, then the poor and vulnerable population, they suffer the most. And we try to avoid that in building an inclusive and equitable recovery capacity. Inclusive recovery capacity means the most vulnerable must be supported first in coping and responding. As climate change, urbanization, and migration intensify disaster vulnerabilities, it is increasingly important to prepare in advance for achieving resilient recovery. So I give you the second tweet, resilient recovery. This is key. The recovery must be resilient, that must be able to build on itself and becoming a source of resiliency. First question, what are the critical and priority issues to be addressed in post-disaster recovery? I'm sure all of us, we will elaborate on this. Let me give you two issues, two suggestions. The first one is that resilient recovery targets strengthening governance systems, improving lifeline services, ensuring food security and sustainable agriculture, and diversifying livelihood in order to protect social protection mechanisms. This reflects a much broader meaning of the concept of resilience, which is now going to be captured in the new communication of the European Commission on a strategic approach to resilience in the EU's external action. Tomorrow, the College, headed by President Juncker, they shall, I hope they will, adopt the resilience package, the communication that we have prepared with all colleagues in EAS, DG DevCo, and all other DGs. One of the priorities in this communication will be, of course, leading with resuming agricultural production, resuming food systems, resuming the normality of feeding population. For this, we are operating PROACT. PROACT is a system that will enable quick action, also foreseeing where the disasters are going to strike, El Niño, La Niña, droughts and floods alike. We try to prevent them, calculate the impact together with FIO, WFP, and many other organizations using the technologies of our Joint Research Center in ISPRA, the satellite technologies, in order to assess the likelihood impact. This is only one kind of disaster, of course, but it's a disaster hitting very, very strongly on food production. And this year, unfortunately, we have famine in few countries. The second question is, how can response and preparedness capabilities can be enhanced in a post-disaster recovery context? Again, two suggestions. First of all is building the interface between humanitarian and development action. This has been struggling, all of you, together with me, we have been struggling with the concept of linking relief and rehabilitation to development. How would you go into humanitarian assistance on crisis, and then from there building into resilience towards development? Not easy, because the urgency and the time is obviously against the rationality of long-span intervention. But I think we are improving on that more and more. The communication is in fact centering on this very concept of linking relief to development. The second suggestion is that identifying functioning systems within existing local institutions is key. So whenever a disaster strikes, you have to identify who can function, who's functioning actually after the disaster. And therefore, loading, giving responsibilities, trusting, delegating that institution, that body of the government, or indeed even of the private sector, to take on the maximum extent possible resilience actions and reconstruction. The third question, don't worry, I have only 5. I go quickly. How can direct internal and external resources can be effectively directed? This is a question for all partners. I don't like the word donors. The word donors entails an old conception of relationship with this donors-recipient. The relationship is partners. Partners which have political interests, which have commercial interests, economic interests, and they cooperate, not excluding, of course, development cooperation, which includes grants. But this is not the point. It's an arrival point, it's a mean to an end, rather. Pre-pan financial protection is the first key. We have to be ready. So we have to allocate, we have to foresee. The second point is, of course, looking at repayment. And therefore, we are looking at this G7 initiative on climate risk insurance, which aims to increase access to direct or indirect insurance for up to 400 million of the most vulnerable people. The G7 recognizes the significant funding will be necessary and can leverage $7 billion of risk from private insurance and reinsurance industry. It's needless to say that the overall level of investments is essential in what we do. That's why in these days, tomorrow and the day after tomorrow, you will hear a lot about the EU External Investment Plan, which increasing the overall extent of investment makes societies more robust and resilient, certainly against striking and disasters. Second last question, what are the challenges to achieve a resilient recovery? I think I would put the question in another way, which is, what is the link between resilience and recovery? Again, when we talk about recovery, we should aim at resilient recovery. As I said before, this is a key of my take on here, and if there is a concept that I would like you to go on with is this, resilient recovery 1. Investing in risk management and building capacities for preemptive and early action. Finally, what are the lessons learned from recent post-disaster recovery processes? While there are important and expanding efforts to minimize disaster impacts through disaster risk reduction, the recovery function following disasters is increasingly recognized as critical and has been incorporated in the 2015 Sendai Framework as Priority 4, which focuses on Build Back Better. This priority provides an important premise for engaging key stakeholders to plan and implement post-disaster recovery in a manner that reduces disaster risks. Recovery offers a critical opportunity to build back better and reduce future disaster risk through risk-informed land use planning, improved building standards, and their enforcement and safety nets for affected communities. Last message from me is, of course, that local governments are key in the protection and in the reduction of the effects of disasters and are key in the rebuilding after the disaster in the resilient recovery. Local government, therefore, are in charge. It's up to partners to come up with the systems that will help to increase the overall resilience of the society. And that's one of the inspirations behind the communication that the Commission will adopt hopefully tomorrow. The new communication on a strategic approach to resilience in the EU external action. With these few words, I would like to wish you good work and proceeding with the conference. Thank you.
I don't know if you appreciate, like myself, his talk. The director, Ridolfi, give us some treats. Inclusion, yes. Resilience and recovery, that's important. He give us treat. He give us area of thinking also. Thank you very much, Director, for that. And also, he remind us that we are partners, and that's great. Specifically talking with someone coming from Haiti. Most of the time, we have to suffer from donors type of attitude, and we like partners. Thank you very much. Now I'm going to invite another great speaker. It's the Director Walba, who is going to give us his point of view.
Thank you very much, Yolene. The disadvantage of going after Director Ridolfi is that half of my speech is gone, you know? So he was saying, okay, I had this point, I'm gonna take this point out. But at the same time, I can't also tweet everything that he's saying. So I hope that my team is doing that. I'm a recently converted Twitter. So I have 3 points really to make over here in terms of framing the discussion. The first part is, why does it matter? Why does resilient post-disaster recovery matter? And the second is, you know, how do we define it at the World Bank and how do we practice it? and then finally a little bit about the imperative and the opportunity. So on the first point, it matters because the costs of post-disasters are significant, and delaying recovery creates much more significant challenges. Whereas anticipating recovery, preparing for it, building back better, prepares one for subsequent actions and coping with disasters in a way that significantly reduces losses and damages. So we've seen the earthquake in Nepal in 2015 with estimated damages upwards of $5 billion, losses of about $2 billion, and then recovery needs nearly $6.7 billion, which is about a third of GDP. This is a significant cost. We've seen in cases of recurrent disasters that are happening in certain countries and starting to take the action, significantly reduce these disasters. Over the span of barely 14 years in working with the government of India over 2 cyclones, the result of investment of a little bit about $255 million in terms of building shelters, in terms of practicing drills, evacuations, building institutions and regulations, has resulted in a subsequent cyclone, resulting in the very efficient evacuation of about 1 million people and a reduction in losses of about 99.6% of the human lives. So preparedness, recovery do pay off. Now, we know also that the increasing magnitude of disasters and their recurrence is also exacerbating the impact. And this has also shifted the way we do resilience recovery towards evolving from recovery practices that emphasize predominantly simple physical reconstruction to a much more comprehensive process that restores the socioeconomic fabric of the affected communities. Now, the definition, my second point, the definition of resilient recovery for the World Bank. It's about ensuring that affected communities recover effectively and swiftly from the impact of disasters, and in the process, build physical and socioeconomic resilience for future disasters. So it's no longer just about upgrading an infrastructure or putting in disaster-resilient technologies. It's much more than that. It's like Director Ridolfi mentioned. It's about governance, it's about lifeline services, it's about livelihoods, and like the Deputy Prime Minister said, leave no one behind. So these are all critical. I mean, social protection mechanisms for the vulnerable communities are an imperative as part of resilience. Now, the whole idea of strengthening recovery systems and building recovery readiness is about a no-regret approach and with important co-benefits in terms of managing disaster risk and building resilience at national and community level. So how do we do it at the World Bank? And obviously you've seen that it is goes beyond one institution. This is becoming a concept and an approach that we're all subscribing to. The first thing is it's the country leadership, and we start with the damage and needs and losses and needs assessment. And then subsequently, it's about thinking also from a developmental perspective about how do you bring in the financing, how to use risk and contingent financing and insurance-based products to provide support. And then it's the importance of working with communities and putting in place quick response tools. For instance, scalable social protection systems. Over the last year in Kenya, the World Bank has provided support, direct cash transfers to about 160,000 households that were affected by droughts. We also support governments in planning, financing, and implementing recovery program planning in the aftermath of disasters. But we support governments to prepare for future disasters, hence the promotion of Build Back Better approach to infrastructure, as well as strengthening the recovery systems and strengthening governance. So with the EU and the UN, we have launched the Disaster Recovery Framework Guide, which helps countries plan for recovery ahead of disasters and provides a flexible methodology that gets adapted by the countries. It was launched in the second World Reconstruction Conference 3 years ago, and since then it's been used by Fiji, Malawi, and Nepal to customize recovery plans for their needs. Now on to my third point, the imperative. Now we are talking about recovery. We're having the additional exacerbating factor of the conflict and fragility, that in many contexts in which we're operating, there's additional challenges and strains being put. Like Director Ridolfi said, now we have to span working across, and do better nexus between the humanitarian and the developmental. Now, trends such as climate change and urbanization, which is going at a very fast pace, and you add on top of them conflict, are exacerbating the magnitude of disasters and are exacerbating its impact, especially on the poor and the vulnerable households, which are the most affected by disasters. So disaster recovery in this regard can become an opportunity for addressing those underlying vulnerabilities and risk factors and tackling the drivers of fragility and conflict. So for instance, as part of those different approaches that we do, in Iraq, for instance, the damage and needs assessment was conducted using very interesting and innovative technologies that I invite you at 4 o'clock if you want to know more about. There'll be a session about them. And this was completed in about 10 days, and it has informed a reconstruction and recovery program of about $350 million. Similar approaches were adopted in Nigeria towards operating in a context that's not just affected by disasters, but also that's being affected by conflict. So that is a little bit the imperative of needing to operate within a fragility and conflict state. Now on to the opportunity. The opportunity is that we have partnerships today that are unparalleled. Not those old relationships Director Ridolfi mentioned. These are about partnerships that bring multiple actors towards a common development agenda. Now, with the EU, collaboration has been focusing on improving climate and disaster resilience in Africa, Caribbean, and Pacific countries via the ACP-EU Natural Disaster Reduction Program, as financed by the EU, managed by the Global Facility for Disaster Reduction Program. And we have had thus far, since 2011, 80 different projects that have been financed. Similarly, we have the 2008 declaration bringing the EU, UN, and the World Bank together towards putting the common standards and protocols for post-crisis and post-disaster responses that bring the operations from assessment to recovery under the leadership of the affected countries. So within this new framework, I very much look forward to this discussion, and thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you very much, Dr. Walma. And I was listening carefully and try to find out what are you going to repeat. But it brings new idea, new perspective for us. Then it's good. And I really appreciate it. It tells us why, how, and it tells us that we have to anticipate. And we take notes one more time. At that point, I'm going to introduce to you the other panelists. You know, when you're doing advertising, sometimes they give you a little bit of information, and then each time you're asking yourself, what next? And that's what I did for the panels there. I give you a little bit of information, and you're still asking yourself, who is the 3 other people who are there? That make it spicy. Okay, we have 2 ladies in the panel. We have gender balance, and if as a matter of fact, it's not balanced at all. There's more lady there than whom. I didn't say so. I was saying that that's 2 ladies there can balance. That's 5 men. But you know, if the honorable wake up, and if I stand up behind him, I'm going to look out so tiny that I'm afraid that we cannot really balance that 5 gentlemen. Anyhow, that's to tell you that Tracy Police she's currently, oh no, I write it on another paper. She wrote it for me because she said that her title changed, right? Please, can you tell your titles to the people? Because I don't have the people.
Permanent Secretary, Department of Housing, Urban Renewal and Telecommunications.
She's the Permanent Secretary for the Department of Housing, Urban and Telecommunication. That's the right one. Thank you very much. But she's in the Caribbean nearby us, and she speaks Creole like myself. In addition, she speaks English, but a good English, not my ones. Mrs. Polius is graduate from the University of West Indies, and she's an economist. And even she looked tiny, but she's married and she has a daughter. For the one looking at her, And she's married. Be careful. And she's going to tell us a lot of good things. And then nearby her, we have Mr. Paul Kalilumbe, right, Kalilumbe. Is working for the Malawi Government Civil Service for 30 years. My goodness. He's younger than me. He has 11 years in education and 15 years in various districts in Malawi as a district commissioner. He's appointed since 2016 as the director in charge for disaster response and recovery activity in Malawi under the Office of the Vice President, who is the Minister of Charge on disaster activities. Mr. Kalilumbe attended the University of Malawi, and he obtained also a diploma in education and a Bachelor of Arts. The last one is not the least, Marko Blagojevic. I said it well. Close enough. I have to tell my teacher who make me repeat yesterday that I'm still making mistakes. Can I call you Marco? Okay. Marco is the director of the Serbian government Public Investment Management Office. He joined the government of Serbia in 2014 after the catastrophic flood. He became the director of the newly established Office for Flood-Affected Area Relief and Reconstruction. He has a large experience in disaster risk management system in Serbia, and he worked in several organizations. If I have to tell you all of the organizations was working on, we're going to never finish, but he was in the council in Europe. He works for GIS, for USAID, UN agency, seems to be everywhere. Very good. That's that great panel that we are going to have. And what's going to happen now, I'm going to be seated, and we are going to have a conversation between us first, and then a conversation between us and yourself. And I'm going to have the privilege to ask the first questions. Okay. Remember that I told you that the question will be in 4 parts, since to be able to reach the objective of the session. The first question is going to address the priority issue in post-disaster recovery. And my first question will be for the Honorable Siaosi Sovaleni. Mr. Sovaleni, in 2014, there is a Hurricane Ian who caused significant damage to housing and critical infrastructure in Tonga. Following that cyclone, the Tongan government rapidly assessed the damage and implemented a recovery program. Could you tell us what were the critical and the priority issues to be addressed in post-disaster recovery phase?
Thank you very much. Just a bit of a background. Cyclone Ian was that Category 5 cyclone I mentioned earlier on. It hit Tonga in January 2014. One group of islands, about 70% of the shelter was badly damaged. So in terms of like prioritizing, from our experience, post-disaster recovery doesn't happen in isolation. There's the pre-disaster phase, whereby you get information about the damages and convening committees, especially for the region that will be affected. So immediately after disaster, we will convene what we call a National Emergency Management Committee. Basically, this is a legislated committee with authority to actually assign resources. And one of the key events is actually assessing the preliminary assessment of the disaster. And based on that, we can actually categorize what kind of disaster, what level of disaster we're talking about. something local, something that doesn't affect that many people, we will try and see whether we can deal with it on our own. Then the next level up, we'll see whether we can talk with partners about actually providing some assistance. So we actually categorize, we try and actually establish that. At what level are we talking about in terms of disasters? And even up to a level where we can actually recommend to the Prime Minister to actually declare a state of emergencies. So that's a very critical institution arrangement that we have in place through legislations to actually try and have better coordination in terms of responding. So with that committee, we not only identified at the level of the disaster, but we also need to actually do an assessment of our capacity and capabilities. This will be looking at manpower, we're looking at financial resources and so forth. Cyclone Ian, one of the key challenges was the fact that it's in the outer islands. We're talking about 15 or so islands that are about 1 hour or 45 minutes flight time from the main island. So one of the key issues that we have to actually look at is logistic. How can we help that particular islands? And also in prioritizing, we look at short-term and also long-term priorities. Okay, the most immediate one is to actually find out what's happening. So we need to establish communication. We need to actually look at what do we need to actually supply. I mean, we have to send boats. We need to find out the status of the airports and so forth. So that's the first responders. So when we send all those medical supplies and so forth, we also send another assessment team. So that team will actually try and validate the initial preliminary assessment to actually find out, provide more information to the committee about what's really happening. So assessment to us is one of the key priorities, to actually finding out a very a good picture of what really happened. And because our response, our efforts will very much depend on that information, on that assessments. Also, assessing our own capacity and capability is also important to actually find out whether we need additional help from partners or whether we can cope with it on our own. So, and dividing them up between short-term and long-term are some of the critical issues that we actually have to deal with. I mean, I'll give you one example. I mean, deciding whether we put resources into temporary shelters or we bypass that and leave it so that we can have more financial resources to provide more long-term shelters for the affected communities. Because if we build temporary shelters, that means we have less financial resources to actually use to rebuild the affected communities. So we also have to weight it up with putting people on emergency, some of the halls we can designate as an emergency hall, whereby we can actually get people to actually move there temporarily while we actually try and provide other key services to them. So it's not really one or two things, but a multitude of priorities that we need to tackle, we need to manage. And then lastly, one of the key important, I guess, issue is partner coordination. There are a lot of partners out there with good intention who want to help. But you need to establish very clear procedures, because otherwise they may very well overwhelm you, even with those good intentions, and you're going to end up with another disaster on your hands. So I'll end there, moderator. Maybe I can answer some questions later on. Thank you.
Thank you very much to keep in at to remind us that even the international help sometimes can become a secondary disaster. That's happened to us after the earthquake in 2010. And fortunately, they don't ask me to talk about that today. But you're talking about partners, and when you're talking about partners, I saw you looking at the director Roberto Ridolfi. He seems to be a good partner for you. Then I'm going to ask him the next question. How could the European Union external investment plan will contribute to build back better in post-disaster recovery effort?
Thanks a lot. Well, the external investment plan aims to create more sustainable and decent jobs. That is giving to collectivity, but also to individuals, the strength to become their own family resilience. If you don't have a job, if you don't have a solid and decent income, you can't forecast for disasters response on your own individual level, because we have the state, the local government, the local communities, and then the individuals. At the end of the day, we are individuals, and we have to try to cope with the risks, adverse situations. So the external investment plan will push a very innovative instrument, which is a guarantee for investments where today the private sectors are not investing. And I'm not talking only of foreign investors. Even local investors are flying money out. As we speak, there is a lot of money that is flying out of African countries that could be invested in their own countries, but the risk perceived is too high. So the plan working on de-risking on climate, on regulations, on government, on legislation, de-risking on commercial aspects, de-risking on marketing, de-risking on tariffs. De-risking is an effort that goes only if there is somebody else risking. If you are risking with me, I try to de-risk you so that you go and invest in a country where today nothing is happening. And this will go out of windows. Sustainable agriculture, including climate smart, very adaptive agriculture. We have to push biodiversity rather than chemical. This is a place where we can push a lot, and there is a very big ground to make on that. As we speak, in another place, there is a conference talking about an index, an agro-biodiversity index that will make a lot to push that. But we are also looking at urban areas. The more and more the world is made of cities, producing wealth, producing also problems, honestly. And in cities, you need to cope with disasters because they can strike very, very badly in cities. So waste management, you have seen what had happened in Ethiopia a few weeks ago. Waste management is one of them. Water management, so important in disasters, pre and post management. So rural economy, but also urban economy, not to talk about renewable energy, the ability of a country to restart immediately with provision of renewable energy by solar or wind will be essential for the resilient recovery. So I mentioned these as three aspects that the external investment plan will push. And of course, by pushing it, we will look at the regulation, the regulatory environment. Are there problems impeding people to do these kind of investments and therefore creating jobs, but also on the other side, creating more robust and resilient communities?
Thank you very much. And I was listening to you, and I wanted you to repeat, create decent job. You said create job on the second time, but I like the decent job because sometimes people seems to have a job, but that job cannot help them to empower themselves. As a matter of fact, that decrease their own capacity. When you have people who are working and who make money, then they cannot even buy enough food to replace their biomass, and that they consume to do the work, and we are not going to build that community. Thank you very much. We are going to talk now about challenge and lesson learned in post-disaster recovery. And this time, Marco, my new partner, that's for you the question from Serbia. In Serbia, you have a floating and landslide in the same year that the hurricane even passed in Tonga, and that's in 2014. And that's affected 20% of your population and caused more than 4% of your GDP. Since then, Serbia adopted a new approach to disaster risk management. Could you tell us what are the lessons from the 2014 event?
Yes, the floods that Serbia has experienced in 2014 were catastrophic. They did affect over 22% of the population, over 2/3 of the territory of the country. And the total effects of the disaster have been assessed at nearly 5% of our GDP. And, but this is only one part of the problem. The other part of the problem was in the fact that it caught Serbia completely unprepared. We had no system in place to respond to overwhelming needs. social and infrastructure. No system whatsoever. We didn't have governmental entity in charge for the recovery or the reconstruction. We didn't have the rules. We didn't have a single piece of legislation that would regulate the proper management of post-disaster recovery and reconstruction. And we had no money. So we were literally entirely out of resources to handle the devastating situation that we were faced with. Literally in the midst of floods, the government has created a completely new government entity. Formal name of it was the Flood-Affected Areas Relief and Reconstruction Office. And I was invited to manage this office. I joined the government, came from the private sector, and I was faced with yet another disaster, which was the way that the government functions, or at least this is the way that I saw it coming from the private sector. It took us 3 months to get the process going. The recovery and reconstruction process. We have launched the PDNA relatively soon after the floods, with the assistance of the World Bank, the UN, and EU in particular, which has been our largest donor or the development partner, as the director has described it. And this is, actually I appreciate that he has mentioned the partnership instead of the donor-recipient relations, because this is the way I would like to see it work. It doesn't always happen like that in practice, though. We used to develop the slogan for the office from the very beginning, and it said, "We do our best to accommodate our donors," which may sound ridiculous, but this is exactly what we needed to do in order to be able to help the donors make good on their pledges. The EU was kind enough to organize for us a donors conference. It happened in July of 2014, which is roughly 2 months after the floods, where the donors from around the world have gathered together and collected a significant amount of money, where the EU remained the largest, by far the largest donor of all. And we had to work actually very hard to make this actually pledges happen. Bosnia, for example, have been able to implement, this is information from several months ago, was able to implement 37% of the donations that have been pledged on this conference. Serbia, on the other hand, has been able to implement 106% of all the donors that have been pledged on this conference. Because knowing how these things work and having had previous experience with the donors, I have worked with my colleagues to put together something that we called an extortion team that has been working very closely with the donors to actually make the pledges turn into actual donations. And it's never easy, but it's doable, and we have proven that it is doable. And with the help of the donors in particular, and the lenders, and the World Bank being the largest of the lenders that have contributed to the post-flood reconstruction and the recovery and reconstruction process, we have been able to do a lot. The damage has been assessed at some $2 billion US dollars, damage including the losses. What we had available when the funds are concerned was around 600 million US dollars. And I think that we did the best we could with the money that was actually 1/3 of the estimated value of the effects. We have assisted over 20,000 families with cash grants. We have assisted tens of thousands of small businesses and small farmers. We have implemented hundreds of projects of the reconstruction of the infrastructure, be it preventive infrastructure or the local infrastructure, communal infrastructure. We have, in spite of the huge damage that our power production and distribution system has sustained, Serbia didn't have power cuts, not even for a single day. We have truly done a lot, predominantly with the assistance of our international development partners. However, we realized that this was not the first flood. It may have been the most devastating, but it was definitely not the first flood that Serbia has experienced. It wasn't going to be the last. And the floods are not the only risk that Serbia is exposed to. You have mentioned landslides. 30% of the territory of the country is under the risk of landslides. We're exposed to the risk of droughts. The estimated value of damage caused by floods over the period of 25 years was estimated $130 million per year, in average, over the past 25 years. The damage of droughts was estimated at $500 million per year, which accounts for 1.4% of our GDP every single year. So we have been, and we are, and we will continue to be exposed to natural hazards, which is why we realized very soon after the disaster that to recover and to reconstruct is not going to be enough. We started shifting our focus toward prevention, some would say very soon after the disaster. Some 6 or 7 months after the disaster, the government has passed a National Disaster Risk Management Program, which is the first program of its kind the government in Serbia has ever passed. Afterwards, the government has passed an action plan to implement this program. We have put into place a sustainable recovery and reconstruction operation governed by a completely new law on reconstruction that has replaced the ad hoc law that we have put into place just to be able to deal with the effects of 2014 floods. We have passed a completely new law on reconstruction that will regulate every future, God forbid, reconstruction process, post-disaster reconstruction process. It is fully aligned with the Sunday framework. We have also drafted a first of its kind, the law on, in Serbia at least, the law on disaster risk and crisis management, also fully aligned with the Sunday framework. It is now pending in the parliament. And these are all non-structural measures that we have implemented. We have also implemented some structural measures as much as we could have afforded to do. It's going to take more than 1 billion euros to actually implement all the measures that are envisaged to be implemented by the action plan for the implementation of the national program. But we are, and this is the money that we cannot afford, at least not at this point in time. But there are some measures that we cannot afford, and we're doing everything that we can in order to come to a situation where we will not regret that we haven't done something that we could have and could have afforded ourselves to do. We have invested billions of euros over the past 17 or 18 years into development. Barely any of it has been invested into prevention. And one flood has proven how a single disaster can render considerable investments into development completely useless. And that's why we have made sure that it comes and stays, if not on the top, then at least very close to the top of our development agenda in the years to come.
Thank you. Thank you, Marco. And I have to say that in 3 years, you do a lot.
We've done this in 2 years, actually.
That's in 3 years. That was
we
in
spent
2014.
every single dime that we had a year ago.
You just said that you build a structure and you already have a law and you have a law in parliament. That's a lot in I can say, in 3 years.
What we
Congratulations.
have now is a completely different government entity where the recovery and reconstruction represents only part of its functions, because this is what we believe was the way to make it sustainable. I do not believe that the government will continue to finance the existence of a body that would be solely dedicated to the recovery and reconstruction.
Yeah.
So we transformed it into something a lot bigger than it was at the very beginning, something bigger than it was ever thought it would be. We're now operating as a public investment management office. We're operating in many different areas where reconstruction and recovery makes only one fraction of what we do. This is what we believe we needed to do in order to make this whole operation sustainable, in order to be able to maintain the capacity that we have built while working on the recovery and reconstruction after the floods in 2014.
Thank you very much. That's a very positive example. Right now, I'm going to go back to my neighbor, and Honorable Sovaleni, can you tell us what's the challenge lesson, what to do and what we don't have to do in a matter of rebuilding infrastructure and livelihood in very remote island communities?
I think the question should be, what's not a challenge? For a small island developing states like Tonga, there's multitude of challenges. But in the recent disasters, one of the key challenges is actually working with partners, especially when they have a long list of requirements that comes with whatever assistance they provide. And one of those key ones is actually determining who the beneficiary should be. I'll take the cyclone Ian that I mentioned earlier on. So when the cyclone hit, a lot of houses were badly damaged and need to be reconstructed. So the question is that, who should be the beneficiary? The person who was living at the house at the time, or the owner of the house? So there was a lot of to and from the partners in Tonga and government of Tonga, who should be the beneficiary? You know, imagine if someone just came in and house sit on that particular house because you're traveling to New Zealand or Australia, and then the cyclone hit. According to that initial policy, third person should own the new house, not the person who actually owned the house. So that was something that we believe moving forward that need to be clarified in terms of working with partners, who should be the beneficiaries. In Tonga, we also have another issue. It's about our land systems. We need permission from the landowners before we can do something about that particular piece of land. And that landowner might be in New Zealand, United States, or wherever. So until you find consent, get consent from that particular landowner, you can't do anything about it. Doesn't matter who the beneficiaries are. So those are some of the key issues. And then finally, again, it's about financial resources. I mean, given the scope of the disaster, what can you do? What can government actually do? Should we build a house for them? Should we do it on a share basis? Should we provide some amount to actually try and get them on their feet? I know there's some discussion about government should not be spending money on it, but we tend to consider it as investing. I mean, if we invest on building better houses, you know, if we invest on building better sanitation for those homes, we are very likely not to face any major issues post-disaster. But if we say, okay, this is not our thing, you find some money, you build your own little shelter, you have your own substandard sanitation, toilets and what have you, we're gonna face a huge, bigger problems afterward. Because we have to deal with sanitation problem, we have to deal with potential health issues, we have to deal with the next time the cyclone revisit our islands. Because that shelter, if it's substandard, it's not up to a building code standard, it's gonna be blown away again. And then we're gonna go through the same cycle again. So you have to value, to actually weigh up whether to spend some money or to invest some money for the future of that particular community.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Let me turn myself to St. Lucia now and ask my sister Tracy Poleus about, since they have a recent disaster in St. Lucia, what is the lesson learned? Could you share St. Lucia experience in or your plan to reforming housing policy and the program to make housing in the formal and informal housing well located and resilient to natural disaster.
Thank you, Yolan. In St. Lucia, in 2010, St. Lucia experienced the impact of Hurricane Thomas, which is not necessarily which is the hurricane with one of the largest impact in recent years. This resulted in damage and loss of about 43% of GDP. And one of the experiences during that event was that a community which lived just below a hillside, there was land slippage, and which resulted in the loss of many lives in that community. And this has informed policy in many ways in St. Lucia, because in the development of our communities and in infrastructural development, we are now looking at vulnerability and hazard assessments as part of our planning. And additionally, it informed the design of our latest risk reduction program, which is the Disaster Vulnerability Risk Reduction Project, which is a World Bank investment co-financed by the European Union. Actually, it was additional financing by the European Union. And one of the components of that project, we're looking at developing a platform for open data sharing that would result in sharing of data across institutions of government to improve planning and decision making, hydraulic data, and all other data that would improve, also related to the health sector, that would improve our approaches to planning and decision making in St. Lucia. With respect to housing, we do have some supply side issues in St. Lucia. The government has recognized the limited availability of housing. And one of the programs that the government of St. Lucia is implementing, which we've been implementing for many years, but we've been building upon that and improving the design of that program, is the program for rationalization of unplanned developments. And included in the current form that we're implementing is the settlement upgrade program. We are conducting hazard assessments to ensure that the communities are safe for residents, and also ensuring that we implement mitigation plans to reduce vulnerability to events, and added to that, looking at community awareness, building awareness of hazard mitigation, and also practices related to the maintenance of the investments like culverts and drains, disposal of garbage, and so forth. In terms of, so that's related to the informal housing settlement that we are formalizing and regularizing. In terms of formal approaches to developing housing, the government has developed a housing policy and a strategic plan of action for implementing that policy. And some of the areas include increasing the availability of land for housing, and improving infrastructure and reducing the infrastructure costs for such housing developments. And we have made some significant strides in that area. One other area relates to improving housing information system that we are currently looking to focus on, improving information on the rental market, improving information on the cost of building housing, to provide information and to reduce the asymmetry in the market for developers and investors, and also improving the legal and administrative framework for housing delivery. In terms of some of the successes, I would say one of the major successes is the success of the PROUD program, as well as the improvements the government has made in terms of identifying parcels of land and looking at the implementation of infrastructure for delivery of those housing projects. In terms of areas where we could do better, I would say is the development of partnerships between the government, both as in its role as the regulator to improve the architecture and the environment for investment in the housing market, and the private sector on the supply side, meaning contractors and investors who want to invest in the market, but the private sector on the financing side from the commercial banks, the credit union, who want to finance housing delivery, and as well, not to forget the insurance side, related to not just the insurance of housing assets, but the insurance of livelihoods in communities so that you have better recovery post-disaster. And looking at creative methods for financing housing, especially in communities where people are poor, so that you do not have a situation that people cannot afford housing because commercial bank, they are not necessarily bankable from a commercial banking perspective. So the government has been doing some financing from the perspective that a lot of the housing we do on the Proud, people pay in terms of peppercorn payments. But we would like to see a situation where we could have meaningful partnerships so that we have the financial sector as a viable partner to provide housing at affordable rates and looking at affordable innovations in the market to allow for housing delivery. I think that's all from me for now. Thanks.
Thank you. But I have more questions for you, but I will talk with you after all because we are running out of time, and I will definitely want to hear the voice of the representative of Malawi, Mr. Paul Kalumbe. And I realized that your country was exposed recently to drought and flood. We want to know what was the challenge experience that you have in the recent years.
Thank you. Indeed, Malawi was affected by the impact of La Nina and El Nino phenomena. This has resulted in droughts and floods becoming frequent in Malawi. For instance, in 2015, we had floods, and these affected almost 1.1 million of the population in Malawi. After these floods, we had a post-disaster needs assessment, which we conducted in collaboration with our partners, development partners, and the losses caused by the floods were estimated at $335 million. And the recovery and reconstruction needs, which arose from those floods, were costed at $494 million. In 2016, after the floods, we had drought in the country, and this affected 6.7 million people in the country. These are 24 districts out of the 28 districts we have in the country. So after the drought, we had a food insecurity response plan, which we drew up together with our partners, and we prepared humanitarian assistance to the population amounting to 6.7 million people of the country. This was conducted from July 2016 up to March this year. In terms of challenges, prior to 2015, we did not have a disaster recovery framework in the country. So whatever we were doing was just doing it haphazardly. So after these floods, with the intervention of the various departments in the country and the various partners, we developed this plan. We're still finalizing it. So that was something which hampered our efforts. At the same time, another challenge is the lack of resources for post-recovery activities. In our national budget, we have funds, but most of these funds are for response. We do not have adequate funds for post-recovery activities. At the moment, we are relying on partners to assist us in developing post-recovery activities. For instance, the key partner we have at the moment is the World Bank. So it has been supporting us For instance, we have a project known as Malawi Floods Emergency Recovery Project. This involves rehabilitation of those areas that were affected by floods in 2015 and restoration of the livelihoods of those people affected. This is being sponsored, is being done in collaboration with the World Bank. We also have another project which is responding to the issue of resilience. We call it Malawi Drought Recovery and Resilience Project, also funded by the World Bank to an amount of 104 million US dollars. Now, the good thing about these projects is that the way they are being implemented is multi-sectoral. So it's not only the government, but other government departments, apart from our department, and also the NGOs. In the development of some of the frameworks for these projects, we not only involved government departments, but other NGOs operating in the country were also involved in the formulation. Another major challenge which we are facing as a government is that most of the aid which is coming to the country for various activities goes through the non-governmental organizations. So in some instances, these non-governmental organizations implement projects in the country, not going through our department. Some of their interventions are not aligned to what we call the National Recovery Framework. So we find some projects which are not on our priority list. So we are trying to take care of this by working with them when we are developing various interventions in the country. And as a community in Malawi, most of the structures in the country have not fully adopted the Build Back Better concept. That is one of the critical issues we need to work upon. In some of the sectors, we don't have fully developed frameworks. We are still working on that. So it is important that we address this as soon as possible if we are to be effective. And even us as a department, the legal framework governing our department, the Department of Disaster Management Affairs, is outdated. It was established after a flood somewhere in 1989. But as things are nowadays, with the introduction of the recovery resilience issues, we need to amend the bill governing our activities so that we incorporate all these issues. Thank you very much.
Thank you, but can you take your mic? Because I have a next question for you. And I want to tell, you are telling us about what the effort that you make, but can you tell us what is the role of the National Disaster Recovery Framework in the concept of post-disaster recovery in your country?
Yeah, the National Disaster Framework in Malawi, this highlights the priority activities that disaster response management stakeholders have to focus upon. At the same time, it is a guide to the implementation of all post-disaster interventions. It guides the recovery investments, resources allocation across short-term humanitarian needs, as well as medium to long-term reconstruction needs. This framework bridges the gap between recovery and development by coordinating interventions across sections, across sectors and geospatial frontiers.
Thank you very much. And definitely, we don't have too much time, and we have so many things to discuss about. And talking about the government effort, I'm going to ask Tracy, can you tell us how the government integrating disaster and climate risk into its financial planning?
One of the things that jumps out at you as you listen to all of the panelists and people who've spoken before us is the cost associated with the occurrence of an event. The damage and loss is usually very significant. And therefore, after every event, you require short-term financing for immediate recovery efforts. So we recognize at St Lucia that you required short-term liquidity. you required also funds for long-term reconstruction. So what we did at St Lucia is that one of the things we did for disaster risk financing is obviously we joined the Caribbean Catastrophe Risk Insurance Fund, which allows us to get a payout after. It's mostly parametric products, but we usually get a payout after major events. And that allows us to finance short-term recovery efforts. We also, as part of our disaster vulnerability risk reduction project, which is approximately 74 million US now, with the World Bank, we have what you call a contingent emergency response component of that program. And so once we have triggered a national emergency, in terms of roll out a national emergency plan, we would get a payout that would allow for cleanup and recovery efforts. So we have that short-term financing gap. We recognize, though, that may not be adequate, and St. Lucia is looking at, in terms of risk financing, looking at and is speaking to the World Bank about a catastrophe deferred drawdown option right now, which is a CAT-DDO, which is a contingent line of credit that would allow for use immediately following a natural disaster, but it would allow for reconstruction needs because it's a much bigger line of credit. And so that is another pillar of our risk financing approach. But in terms of, on the risk identification side, we are implementing an open data sharing platform that would allow us to identify the risk and share information for planning, as I have mentioned. We are also identifying some of our disaster risk and mapping some of our assets with a view to assisting us in being able to quantify losses more easily following a natural disaster. So these are some of the initiatives that we are currently implementing in St. Lucia as it relates to integrating disaster risk into our planning process.
Thank you very much. Right now I'm going to turn on Marco. And Marco, you are telling us about the Public Investment Management Office. Can you tell us what is the main activities of this office?
The newly established office has started operating in December of 2015. One of the reasons is that everyone kept calling the office that we had the floods office, and I kind of hated it because it wasn't the floods office, it was the reconstruction office. So we had to kill it and put in its place a new government entity that would be sustainable. We realized that it will most probably cease to exist with the expiration of funds that we had available to invest into recovery and construction. We need to keep this going. We need to maintain the capacity that we have worked very hard to build that could be engaged again in any future recovery reconstruction effort. And at one point in time, we have transformed the post-flood reconstruction office into a public investment management office. It works in many different areas, manages public investments, or facilitates the implementation of large infrastructure projects in sectors such as the energy, agriculture, social infrastructure, local infrastructure, while it maintains as one of its components the post-disaster recovery and reconstruction. Otherwise, it would have ceased to exist, I believe, and then the capacity that we have worked very hard to build would simply vanish, and we didn't want to let that happen. That's why we kept it going. We're still keeping it going. It works. At the time of the floods in 2014, we didn't have, as I already said, we didn't have the money, we didn't have the rules, we didn't have the government entity. Now, with the signing of the CAT-DDO, which is something that I forgot to mention, unfortunately, with the signing of the CAT-DDO, we have the whole circle closed. We have the government entity, We have the sustainable regulations in place with the new the law based on Sunday framework and with the access to contingent financing, the CAT DDO. We have closed this circle as now we have everything that we need to have in order to be able to respond quickly once, God forbids, similar disaster happens. We have proven that it works. Actually, in March last year, we have had, again, catastrophic floods only on a very limited part of the territory. And we have been able to respond in 3 weeks to disperse first cash grants to flood-affected families. And it took us 3 months to do the same back in 2014, which means that we have the functioning system now in place, and we're working hard to maintain it now as one part of a much larger operation, not a body that is fully dedicated solely to the recovery and reconstruction.
Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, I have 2 news for you, one good and one bad news. The good news is that all of the members of the panel will be available after that session to talk with you and answer to your question for the next, for the entire days and for the next 2 days, as a matter of fact. They agree to have discussion with you and answer to your question. That's the good news. The bad news that you will not have time to ask questions. And during the panel. Okay, that's a bad news because I realized that they have a video taping people, and when you're going to talk with them privately, there will be no video for you. That's what is the bad news. But right now, we are going to conclude our session in the same times that we begin. First of all, but in the reverse side, I'm going to ask the World Bank and the European Union. Then at the end, the Honorable Siaosi Sovaleni to conclude, because he has the privilege to do the opening remark, and he's going to conclude also our session. Then you have the microphone first for your closing remark. You just have 1 minute.
Less than 1 minute. 3 points. First one is well-planned institutional frameworks and financing mechanisms are precondition for successful post-disaster recovery. So preparing better pays off. The second is disaster recovery is efficient if the institutions, policies, laws, and financial mechanisms are set up prior to the disaster rather than in a scramble after the disaster, so that you can do 2 things. You can do things right, and you can do the right things at the same time. And then finally, there tends to be a long gap between disasters and the initiation of reconstruction. We've seen that in many, many places. Preparing better, doing resilient recovery and good preparation pays off and reduces this gap, and this reduces the suffering of both people and the economy. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Roberto?
Yes, madam. I think 2 messages. One is that we have to work in building more resilient societies, 360 degrees, which means both collectivities and individuals and families must be more prepared to shocks. To do that, these people must be able to have assets on which to build on. And they cannot have assets if they will not have decent and sustainable jobs. Number 1 priority. Without that, any effort will be just catching up, and vulnerable groups will be always hit the most. Second message, we have to prepare for preventing rather than repairing. In many cultures, the word maintenance does not exist. Well, the word maintenance in a society means building the resilience for the society to be ready and to be solid against shocks, both physical and intellectual, both in terms of institutions as well as in terms of capacity to react. So institutional building is key, and good governance is the recipe for this institutional building to deliver results.
Thank you very much. That's your turn.
I got a couple of points, only 5. The first one is like, I think it was mentioned by the other panelists, is financing mechanism. In the Pacific, we have a regional one that mentioned by the Vice President of World Bank earlier on, we also have a national one. So we need to be actually clear on what financing modalities you have available for you before the disaster and how you can access it. Second one is actually enforcing legislative measures. There's no point on having a building code if you're not going to enforce it. So that's the second point. The other one is investing on affected communities. As I mentioned earlier on, you might as well invest on better shelters, better sanitation, than having to deal with the consequences afterward. The fourth one is building your community resilience, as Roberto actually mentioned earlier on. We need to actually educate people, and we need to actually raise the awareness that this is not going to be the last cyclones. So, I mean, that's the reality we face in the Pacific. And finally, having a very clear partnership framework. There are a lot of good people out there who want to help, but I think it's very important that you have a clear framework on how you can partner up when there's a need for it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm just, I even don't have time. I take so many notes, and there is so many things interesting was said this afternoon. I forget myself, and I didn't do my job well. I didn't cut anybody. That's why we go out of time. But that was so interesting what they want to share with us that I couldn't resist. I'm sorry. Sometimes. And is, if people know me, the one who know me know how much I like to talk. I have so many notes, then I will, but today I take so much pleasure to listen to you. And thank you very much for your intervention. Please give a word of applause to that group. Thank you very much. And since we are welcome in Belgium, enjoy Belgium.